All right, we're going to begin to consider Othello Act 2. We begin this act in a place of uncertainty. We've been introduced now to a new set of characters in a different context. We're entering into Cyprus, and we are destabilized because of this uncertainty. We don't know who these characters are. We don't know about their relationship to the other individuals that we've already encountered. And Shakespeare does this in order to illustrate or to parallel the emotional experience of the characters that we've already met. They had been tossed about inside of a tempest, and they are only now arriving at Cyprus separately, in a similar place of uncertainty. They're unaware of what has occurred or what has transpired with the other individuals that we've encountered. So, for instance, Desdemona and Iago express concern over Othello's fate. Desdemona, to distract herself, enters into a protracted battle of wits with Iago. And it's that I'd like to consider. So, between lines 105 and 171, as Desdemona, Cassio, and Iago are waiting for word of Othello, they know that the Turkish fleet has been destroyed, or they learn that the Turkish fleet has been destroyed, but they're still waiting on word regarding Othello. Looking at lines 105 to 171, I'd like you to answer two questions. What kind of tone is developed in this conversation? And then compare the way in which Desdemona acts here in this scene with her impassioned defense of Othello. What is different about her character here? What do we learn about her in this situation? Pause the video, think about these two questions, and then come back for my answers. The conversation itself is, on the surface, apparently light and jovial. They engage in banter and demonstration of their respective wits and a contest thereof. However, it's couched in a disturbing context that colors it. On the one hand, Desdemona reveals that she's not being entirely truthful. She says that I am not merry, but I do beguile the thing I am by seeming otherwise. So we have this presentation of a false front. She deceives others in this moment because she's trying to distract herself from her actual emotional experience, her distress and her concern regarding Othello. The other way in which Shakespeare contextualizes this scene in a negative way is by suggesting that there's an imbalance in the power relationships and the proper organization of the relationship between Desdemona and Othello. Cassio, when he is asked by Montano in line 73, who is this? She that I spake of, our great captain's captain. There's an implication of impropriety in the reality that Cassio recognizes, that Desdemona has authority over Othello. Othello willfully submitted himself to Desdemona in the public realm by subjecting his life to her, placing his life in her hands. But Michael Cassio has picked up on that reality, and although he is making light of it, there is again that suggestion of impropriety. We learn here that Desdemona is willing to intercede on behalf of Emilia. She sees that Emilia is being browbeaten by her husband. Iago essentially says in line 100, Sir, would she give you so much of her lips as of her tongue she oft bestows on me, you'd have enough. So he claims that his wife is constantly insulting him. She talks too much. In response to that, Desdemona refocuses his attention on herself, distracting him from Emilia. The conversation that follows is rife with body, base, sexualized discourse, and Iago goes through a description of 4 different kinds of women. A woman who is intelligent and beautiful, intelligent and ugly, foolish and beautiful, and foolish and ugly. So the language itself and the expressions that he uses to characterize each of these women can be difficult to interpret and understand. But the basic gist of his praises for each of these kinds of women is that each one in turn is a kind of whore. He reduces each of them, regardless of their respective characteristics, down to this basic stereotype of the woman who is seeking both sexual pleasure and the opportunity to secure a wealthy husband. Desdemona, however, does not shirk from this conversation, in part because she wishes for this distraction, and in part because she is comfortable with it. Even though Iago's expressions are lewd and crass, she has no difficulty engaging with him on equal footing. She doesn't shy away or blush from this. So it's again a bit of an undercutting of Brabantio and, in fact, Othello's characterization of her. Iago then hits upon the plan to destroy the moor. He sees how friendly Cassio is with Desdemona, how open Cassio is with his own wife, Iago's wife. And he hits upon the plan that he can twist the Moor's imaginings. He can convince the Moor to destroy Cassio himself and convince Othello that Cassio has been overly familiar, that is, he is having an affair with Othello's wife. Now, Iago, in line 263, comes up with a plan. He suggests to Roderigo that Roderigo can go to Cassio, insult him at some point, and then provoke him to violence that will force Othello to dismiss him from his service. In Act 2, Scene 3, we have a revelation of this plan, the full development of this plan. What I'd like you to do is think about these three questions. Pause the video, try to answer them, and we'll begin to build our understanding of this crucial moment in the play as Iago begins to put into place the plan that will actually direct the narrative that is to develop. In a sense, he's usurping control over the narrative in a kind of contest with Shakespeare to see who is going to write the play. Obviously, literally, Shakespeare is composing it, but Iago is the character that seems to develop a plot for the rest of the story, and then orchestrate events such that that plot will be carried out. All right, so let's take a look at some potential answers to these questions and begin breaking down the passages that I identified. With respect to question 1, what does Iago do in order to construct a false public reputation for himself and for Cassio? In this moment, Iago again reveals himself as a kind of meta-theatrical director of the play. We talked about those areas or axes of change in the context of this play. In one of those axes was meta-theatricality, as a character takes on his status as an actor or reveals himself to be a fictional construct. In this moment, Iago starts to use the conventions of stagecraft. If you watch a film adaptation of this play, you'll oftentimes see Iago literally placing characters inside the scene. Roderigo walks in, and Iago says, "No, you're coming in too early. Get back into the rear of the stage. You have blown your entrance." In a way, Iago, in the way he plots out the interactions between Cassio and Roderigo, indicating how they should respond, the kinds of words they should deliver, the lines they should deliver, the actions they should undertake. He's acting like the director of the play. So in Act 2, Scene 3, line 146, he says as an aside to Roderigo, "Away, I say, go out and cry a mutiny," and Roderigo exits. So Iago has control over characters' entrances and exits. He gives them their lines of dialogue. He gives them their cues. He informs them as to the emotions that they should present in order to best affect the plot that he wishes to construct. And in lines 43 and 55, or to 255, we see that him actually composing the plot for the next scene of the play. He constructs a false reputation for other characters as part of the orchestration of this plot. He implies that Cassio drinks each night in order to fall asleep. He's coloring and providing context for the responses that other characters will have to the scenes or to the play that he is developing and will present to them. You can also see that when Othello enters into the scene and begins to try to break up the fight between Cassio and Roderigo that has been inspired by the fact that Roderigo, off stage, has insulted Cassio's honor, Iago only actually tries to interject. He only intervenes in the fight when Othello is present. He lets things come to a head and he lets the fight play out. He then acts when he sees that Othello is there to witness him. So he makes himself seem like he's more reasonable, like he is the one who is in control of himself, like he is the one who is attempting to break up this fight when he knows that he can be properly viewed. So these are some of the ways in which he constructs a false public reputation for himself and for Othello, carefully couching his actions in the appropriate context, responding depending on the audience that is watching him. Look at the conflict between Cassio and Montano and the way in which Othello acts. Earlier on in the play, we noted that Othello has a tremendous amount of reserve. He is not prone to bouts of emotionalism, and even when Brabantio speaks, as Iago puts it, in such scurvy and provoking terms against Othello's honor, Othello does not react. Here, however, he is provoked nearly to violence, and he says that essentially, "I could raise my hand and destroy any one of you." So he's threatening violence against the people who have been involved in this conflict. One of the reasons for that is that these individuals are actually men under his control, and we know that Othello fetches his life and being from men of royal siege, as he says. Everything that he is reliant on the opinion of others around him, of his superiors. In this moment, the very thing that gives definition and shape to his life, his status as a general of Venice, has been called into question. The soldiers under his command, for private and domestic quarrel, have put in jeopardy the city itself. They've raised this ruckus. The bells in the city are ringing, and the people in the city necessarily would begin to think that perhaps the Turkish armada has arrived. Perhaps they were misinformed. Perhaps this is a sign of war coming to Cyprus. So they've imperiled the city and set into this clamorous war simply because of a matter of private personal dispute. In turn, because these are men under his command, Othello and his value, his purpose, have all been called into question. His status as a general is now uncertain because he can't control his men, and he has allowed the city to fall into this state of disrepair. That deep, abiding uncertainty about his own worth comes to the forefront again and helps to explain the violent response that he has in line 195. My blood begins my safer guides to rule. His blood is roiling with this passion. And passion, having my best judgment collied, essays to lead the way. Swoons, if I stir or do but lift this arm, the best of you shall sink in my rebuke. Give me to know how this foul rout began, who set it on, and he that is approved in this offense, though he had twined with me at birth, shall lose me. Because this person has imperiled the public realm, because he has imperiled the city, even if he were my brother by blood, even if I had a private connection with him, he would fall in my rebuke and be cast out. What in a town of war, yet wild, the people's hearts brimful of fear to manage private and domestic quarrel in night and on the court and guard of safety? 'Tis monstrous. Iago, who began it? Look at the consequences of Iago's actions, the way in which the scene has played out because of the context that Iago provided. Iago ensured that he would appear to be the one who is rational and reasonable at this moment in the play, because he was the one calling for calm, reason, and sense. Have you no shame? He says earlier on when Othello comes into the scene. So it is at this moment, of course, that Othello, seeing that Iago is the reasonable one in the situation, would turn to him. So look at how Iago has set context to make Othello rely on him. Now, Iago goes on to say that I love Michael Cassio more than I can put into words. I love him. I know that he is a good man. And in so doing, by saying these things, he makes the smaller critiques that he levels against Cassio appear all the more monstrous because he's Cassio's friend. Of course, he would try to make light the malfeasance on Cassio's part. Cassio is then stripped of his position as Othello's lieutenant. And Shakespeare uses this opportunity to levy a critique of conceptions regarding reputation and identity, those conceptions that Othello has established for himself, that public identity and public reputation actually define who he is. Cassio begins to lament, and he says in line 252, reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I've lost the immortal part of myself, and what remains is bestial. My reputation, Iago, my reputation. Now, Iago looks upon him, and as Iago is wont to do, he pretends to be Cassio's friend. But in the same way that he manipulates Roderigo and he attempts to manipulate Othello, he's always using these people to his own end, putting on all shows of affection and devotion to these people with whom he professes to be friends. As Iago goes on to say, reputation is an idle and most false imposition. Reputation is not something that is true that we create for ourselves. It's something that is imposed upon us externally. Now, as is always the case with a devil like Iago, as is always the case with him as he preaches the word to Roderigo, drawing from traditional or stereotypical wisdom of the age, he is preaching things that are true, but he twists them and perverts them. He injects just enough poison into them to make them deadly, right? While covering over the sin, the destruction, the devastation, the manipulation with a veneer of truthfulness, honesty, and integrity. He is correct. Reputation is a false imposition because it is often got without merit and lost without deserving. Think about the epithet that is constantly applied to Iago. He's honest Iago, but he's anything but. Reputation is idle and most false, as is his. It's oft got without merit, as it was in his case, and lost without deserving, as it was in Cassio's, because the entire situation, the drunken brawl that led him to lose his reputation and lose his public standing and his identity, it's all part of Iago's ploy. All that remains now that he has lost his public identity is bestial or animal. So we have this spectrum of humanity and animality. And Cassio's decisions in this moment, the way in which Iago has reduced him and attenuated him, the way in which Iago has brought him to this point of bestial nature, or this point wherein he has rejected his humanity, speaks to the way in which we can reject our own humanity or embrace the worst parts of ourselves, the animal part of ourselves. Now, because he has been cast out of the public realm, he has lost his public standing and has no reputation whatsoever. Now, he's outside of the realm of humanity. He exists outside of a community of equals, and thus, he's no longer fit to be even considered human. Just like what Brabantio said, right? If such actions have passions free, bond slaves and pagans shall our statesmen be at the end of Act 1, Scene 2. Right? If these men act in such a way as to allow Othello to rape Desdemona, at least rape Desdemona in his twisted imaginings, if they allow this, then they don't have any place within the public sphere. They have been reduced to bond slaves or pagans, men who are not men, in Brabantio's view or in the view of the Elizabethan audience. So here we have this confluence of various ideas that we've been discussing in the play: reputation and identity, animality and humanity, and the way in which they interweave together in order to create this complex commentary on the way in which we relate to public reputation and identity. Keep these ideas in mind as we move on, and Iago begins to carry out his plot to bring Cassio and Desdemona together for innocent and innocuous reasons, but to frame them in such a way as to make Othello insanely jealous and to lead him to destroy everything that he loves and himself.